You're not sad, you're disconnected. This doesn't feel like sadness. You're not crying every night. You're not collapsing under the weight of despair. You're not telling people you're depressed. You still go to work. You still answer messages. You still show up. From the outside, you seem fine, but something feels muted, like the volume of your emotions has been turned down. You don't feel intense pain. You just don't feel much at all. Moments that should excite you land softly. Conversations that should move you pass through without imprint. You laugh, but it doesn't linger. You accomplish something, but it doesn't energize you. You rest, but it doesn't restore you. This isn't the heaviness of sadness. It's the absence of aliveness. And that absence is confusing because you don't have a dramatic story to point to. Nothing catastrophic happened. There's no obvious reason for this quiet flatness. So you tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself you're just tired, or bored, or unmotivated. But late at night, when the noise fades, there's a subtle awareness you don't say out loud. I don't feel fully here. You're not drowning in emotion. You're slightly detached from it. And what if that's the real issue? What if you're not sad? What if you're just disconnected? It's subtle. That's what makes it hard to name. If you were deeply sad, you would recognize it. If you were devastated, you would know. But this feels quieter. You wake up. You move through your routine. You complete what needs to be done. You function. But functioning isn't the same as feeling alive. You notice small things. Music doesn't hit the way it used to. Conversations feel surface level, even when they're meaningful. You scroll for stimulation, but nothing really lands. You're not hopeless. You're not overwhelmed. You're just flat. Like the emotional spectrum is narrowed. Highs are muted. Lows are muted. Everything exists in the middle. And the middle feels safe, predictable, controlled, but also distant. You don't cry often. You don't rage. You don't collapse. You just keep going. You've become efficient with your emotions. You don't let them interrupt your productivity. You don't let them slow you down. You don't let them spill over. And at first that feels strong, composed, stable. But over time, stability without depth starts to feel hollow. You might even question yourself. Am I just ungrateful? I have things to be thankful for. I shouldn't feel this way. That internal judgment pushes the feeling further down. So instead of exploring it, you minimize it. You distract yourself. You stay busy. You keep conversations light. You avoid silence because silence makes the distance more obvious. In silence, you notice how disconnected you feel from your own inner world. Not because there's nothing there, but because you haven't been sitting there long enough to feel it. This isn't sadness, it's disconnection. And disconnection is harder to diagnose because it doesn't scream, it whispers. Disconnection doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, not through dramatic trauma, but through repetition. Small moments where you choose efficiency over emotion. Small decisions where you move on quickly instead of sitting with what you felt. You get hurt. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. You feel disappointed. You say it's fine. You feel uncertain. You distract yourself with productivity. Over time, those small deferrals accumulate. You become skilled at bypassing, not because you don't have feelings, but because you learn that feelings slow you down. And slowing down feels unsafe in a world that rewards momentum. So, you adapt. You become composed. You become capable. You become someone who doesn't make a scene. You regulate quickly. You recover fast. You don't dwell. That looks like strength. And in some ways, it is. But constant self-regulation without reflection creates distance. Distance between what happens and what you actually experience. You stop fully registering your internal reactions. You feel something and immediately convert it into logic. You don't stay with the sensation. You interpret it. You analyze it. You categorize it. But you rarely inhabit it. And inhabiting is what creates connection. Connection to yourself. Connection to meaning. Connection to aliveness. When you bypass emotion long enough, your system adapts. It reduces intensity. It dulls the peaks. It flattens the valleys. This isn't depression in the dramatic sense. It's containment. Emotional containment. You've learned to keep everything within manageable range. Nothing too high, nothing too low. Just steady. Predictable. Controlled. But life isn't meant to be entirely controlled. It's meant to be felt. And feeling includes risk. Risk of discomfort. Risk of vulnerability. Risk of unpredictability. If you've lived in a prolonged state of pressure, pressure to perform, pressure to achieve, pressure to remain stable, your nervous system eventually chooses safety over depth, safety over intensity, safety over expression. You enter a subtle survival mode, not crisis survival, functional survival. You still work, you still socialize, you still respond, but internally you're conserving energy. You're minimizing emotional expenditure because your system believes that full emotional engagement is costly. This is how disconnection forms, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual narrowing. You might notice it in relationships. You care about people, but you don't feel deeply moved. You show up, but you don't feel fully present. You listen, but you're slightly distant. It's not intentional. It's protective. Your system is trying to prevent overload. If you've been carrying responsibility for a long time, if you've been the steady one, if you've been the one who keeps it together, you likely trained yourself to reduce emotional fluctuation because fluctuation feels destabilizing. But in reducing fluctuation, you also reduce aliveness. Aliveness requires range. It requires allowing joy to expand, allowing sadness to surface, allowing anger to register, allowing longing to exist. When you suppress the lows, you also suppress the highs. That's the trade-off. Containment creates predictability, but predictability creates flatness, and flatness feels like disconnection. You might wonder, why don't I feel excited anymore? Why doesn't anything hit? It's not because you've lost your capacity. It's because your system has prioritized safety. Safety from overwhelm, safety from emotional intensity, safety from vulnerability. This often happens when you've been strong for too long, when you've adapted to pressure without processing it, when you've moved forward without pausing to integrate what happened behind you. Your body keeps a record, even when your mind moves on. Unprocessed experiences don't disappear. They compress. And compression reduces sensitivity. Reduced sensitivity feels like numbness. Numbness feels like disconnection. Disconnection feels like quiet emptiness. But beneath the numbness, there's still life, still feeling, still depth. It hasn't vanished. It's just been turned down, and the volume was lowered for a reason. To protect you, to stabilize you, to help you keep functioning. Functioning isn't the enemy, but it's not the same as being fully present. You don't need to label yourself as broken. You don't need to assume something is fundamentally wrong. You need to understand what your system adapted to. Disconnection is often adaptation. Adaptation to stress. Adaptation to expectation. Adaptation to prolonged self-control. You learn to survive efficiently. Now your system needs permission to feel again. Not dramatically, not forcefully, gradually, safely. Reconnection doesn't start with intensity. It starts with noticing. Noticing when you're slightly detached. Noticing when you're on autopilot. Noticing when you avoid silence. Those small moments are entry points. Because disconnection isn't absence, it's distance. And distance can be reduced, not by pushing yourself to feel more, but by allowing yourself to feel without immediately managing it. The feeling is still there. It's waiting, not to overwhelm you, but to be acknowledged. You're not sad. You're not incapable of joy. You're not emotionally defective. You're just slightly disconnected from the parts of you that haven't been given space lately. And space is what begins to restore contact. There's an internal conflict that begins to form. On the surface, you're fine. You meet your responsibilities. You respond when needed. You keep your commitments. Underneath, there's a subtle question. Why doesn't anything feel deeply meaningful anymore? That question feels dangerous, not because it's dramatic, but because it threatens the structure you've built. If you admit you feel disconnected, what does that say about the life you've constructed? You worked for this stability. You created this routine. You shaped this version of yourself carefully. To question your aliveness can feel like questioning your entire identity. So you suppress the question. You tell yourself you're just tired, or bored, or in a phase, but the feeling lingers. Not loud, just persistent. There's tension between gratitude and emptiness. You know you have things to appreciate. You know others might envy your position, so the flatness feels unjustified. You feel guilty for not feeling more, and guilt pushes the feeling further down. You start minimizing it. It's not that bad. I'm just overthinking. I'll snap out of it. But snapping out of disconnection isn't about positive thinking. It's about contact. And contact requires slowing down. Slowing down is uncomfortable for someone who has built identity around competence. Competence means managing. Managing means staying composed. Composure means containing emotion. And containment over time creates internal distance. The conflict deepens when you notice how automatic your responses have become. Someone asks how you're doing. Good. You don't even check internally. You answer reflexively. You've trained yourself to default to stability, even when you're unsure. even when you're empty. That reflex protects you from scrutiny, but it also prevents connection, because connection begins when something real enters the room. You might also notice that you avoid certain spaces: silence, unstructured time, moments without distraction. When nothing is occupying your attention, you feel slightly uneasy, not anxious, just restless. Restlessness is often the doorway to what hasn't been processed. If you stay still long enough, something surfaces: a memory, a frustration, a longing. But instead of staying with it, you reach for your phone, or turn on something to watch, or start doing something productive. You interrupt the emergence, not consciously, habitually, because emergence feels unpredictable, and unpredictability feels unsafe to a system that has relied on control. Control has served you well. It helped you stay functional. It helped you avoid collapse. It helped you navigate pressure. But control has a cost. It narrows emotional bandwidth. You feel less overwhelmed, but you also feel less alive. That trade-off happens quietly. You don't choose it intentionally. Your nervous system chooses it for you. When stress persists long enough, the system prioritizes efficiency. Efficiency means less fluctuation, less intensity, less vulnerability, less exposure. This is survival mode in a refined form. Not panic, not chaos, just emotional containment. You still think clearly. You still act rationally. You just don't feel deeply. And because you're still functioning, no one notices. That invisibility intensifies the disconnection. If you were visibly struggling, people might ask, but you're composed, so no one probes deeper, and you rarely invite them to. Because part of you fears that if you open the door to your internal world, you might not know how to close it. You worry about becoming too emotional, too vulnerable, too exposed. So you stay measured. Measured emotions, measured tone, measured engagement. And that measured life feels controlled, but also distant. The real conflict isn't about sadness. It's about range. You've limited your range, not maliciously, protectively. But protection that never relaxes turns into numbness. You might think, if I let myself feel more, I'll lose control. But control and connection are not opposites. Control is structure. Connection is depth. You can maintain structure while allowing depth. But depth requires permission. Permission to pause before responding. Permission to notice sensation. Permission to acknowledge discomfort without immediately resolving it. That's the uncomfortable middle, where you realize you've been surviving efficiently, but not inhabiting fully. The moment you admit that is not failure. It's awareness. Awareness is not collapse. It's clarity. You don't have to dismantle your life. You don't have to make drastic changes. You don't have to label yourself broken. You just have to recognize that functioning isn't the same as feeling. And feeling won't return through force. It returns through contact. Contact with your own internal experience. Contact with silence. Contact with emotion before analysis. You're not sad. You're not defective. You're not missing something externally. You've just been distant from yourself for a while. And distance feels like emptiness until you begin to close it. Not dramatically, gradually. One moment of presence at a time. The shift doesn't begin with intensity. It begins with noticing. Noticing when you answer automatically. Noticing when you scroll to avoid silence. Noticing when you move forward without checking in. Reconnection isn't dramatic. It's subtle. And subtle work requires patience. If you've been emotionally contained for a long time, your system won't suddenly expand overnight. It doesn't trust intensity yet. It trusts control. So you don't force feeling. You invite it. You create small spaces where nothing needs to be solved. Moments where you sit without distraction. Not to think. Not to fix. Just to observe. At first, you might feel restless. Your mind will want to narrate, categorize, interpret. That's normal. But beneath the narration, there are sensations. Tightness in your chest, a subtle heaviness in your stomach, a faint ache behind your eyes. You don't label it immediately. You stay with it. You breathe, and something softens. Not because the sensation disappears, but because you're no longer avoiding it. Avoidance keeps distance alive. Presence reduces it. You might also begin to notice your reactions in real time. Someone says something that bothers you. Instead of brushing it off instantly, you pause. What did that actually make me feel? Not what you should feel. Not what makes sense, but what actually happened inside. That small pause is reconnection. When you allow irritation to register, when you allow disappointment to land, when you allow longing to surface, your emotional range begins to return. Range includes discomfort, but it also includes joy. When you widen one end, the other expands too. Aliveness comes back gradually, not as a burst, but as subtle color. Music feels slightly deeper. Conversations linger a little longer. Silence becomes less threatening. You're not chasing intensity. You're rebuilding contact. Contact with sensation. Contact with reaction. Contact with your own inner world. And the more contact you allow, the less empty you feel. Because emptiness wasn't absence, it was distance. Distance created by adaptation. Adaptation that once protected you. Now you're teaching your system something new. That feeling doesn't equal collapse. That vulnerability doesn't equal chaos. That being present doesn't mean losing control. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to overhaul your life. You just need to return to yourself, one small, honest moment at a time. As reconnection begins, something unexpected happens. You realize how long you've been living slightly outside yourself. Not completely detached, not absent, just a half step removed. Like you were observing your life instead of inhabiting it. That half step felt safe. It gave you perspective. It gave you control. It gave you the ability to manage situations without being overwhelmed by them. But it also kept you from fully experiencing them. Now as you allow yourself to feel again, the world doesn't suddenly become intense. It becomes textured. There's more variation, more nuance, more depth. You notice the way your body reacts before your mind explains it. A subtle warmth when something resonates. A tightening when something feels off. A heaviness when something hurts. Before you would override those signals, you would reinterpret them, minimize them, translate them into logic. Now, you pause long enough to let them register. That pause is powerful. It interrupts the automatic distance. It brings you back into contact, and contact rebuilds aliveness. Aliveness isn't constant excitement. It's not endless passion. It's not dramatic emotional highs. It's simply presence. Presence with what's happening internally while life unfolds externally. You begin to realize that disconnection wasn't a personality flaw. It was a protective strategy. You protected yourself from overload, from pressure, from disappointment, from vulnerability. You narrowed your range to maintain stability. That strategy worked. It helped you survive seasons that required strength. But survival mode, when prolonged, becomes limitation. It keeps you efficient, but it reduces intimacy. Intimacy with others, intimacy with yourself. Reconnection asks something different of you. It asks for gentleness, not force, not performance, not self-improvement urgency. Gentleness. You don't demand that your emotions return. You create conditions where they're allowed. You slow your reactions. You soften your internal commentary. Instead of saying, "I shouldn't feel this way," you say, "This is what's here." That shift removes judgment. Judgment tightens. Acceptance loosens. Loosening creates space, and space allows feeling to move. When feeling moves, it doesn't stagnate into numbness. It flows. Some days you'll feel more. Some days you'll feel less. But you'll feel honestly, not filtered, not reduced, not curated for stability. You might notice that relationships change slightly. You speak a little slower. You listen more fully. You respond less automatically. You don't rush to reassure others if you're uncertain. You don't rush to dismiss your own discomfort. That honesty deepens connection, not because you're dramatic, but because you're real. And real presence invites real presence back. There's also a shift internally. Your mind becomes less dominant, not because you shut it down, but because you're no longer using it to avoid sensation. Thought becomes support, not shield. Reflection becomes integration, not escape. You can think deeply without disconnecting emotionally. That's integration. Thinking and feeling occupying the same space. You don't lose your composure. You don't lose your competence. You simply add depth back into it. And depth feels different than numbness. Depth has warmth. Numbness has neutrality. Depth has movement. Numbness has stillness. Depth has subtle fluctuation. Numbness stays flat. As depth returns, life doesn't become chaotic. It becomes textured. The small moments carry more weight. A quiet laugh feels real. A brief disappointment feels acknowledged. A simple sunset feels slightly meaningful. Not dramatic, just present. That's what reconnection restores. Presence. You start noticing that you don't need constant distraction anymore. Silence feels less threatening. Unstructured time feels less restless. Because you're no longer avoiding yourself in those moments. You're meeting yourself. And meeting yourself requires courage. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that sits with discomfort without immediately correcting it. The kind that says, "I can handle feeling this." That internal confidence rebuilds trust. Trust reduces the need for distance. Distance decreases. Aliveness increases. You're still stable, still responsible, still composed. But now there's warmth in it. There's depth in it. There's authenticity in it. You're not performing stability. You're embodying it. Embodied stability feels different. It's grounded, flexible, responsive. It allows emotion without collapse. It allows vulnerability without chaos. You realize something important. You were never incapable of feeling. You were protecting yourself from too much feeling. Protection was necessary once, but now it might not be. Reconnection isn't about abandoning strength. It's about softening around it, letting strength coexist with sensitivity, letting control coexist with curiosity, letting competence coexist with honesty. You don't need to become a different person. You don't need to chase intensity. You don't need to manufacture passion. You simply need to remain present when something arises. And the more often you remain present, the less disconnected you feel. Because connection is not something you create externally. It's something you restore internally. It was always there. It was just waiting for space, waiting for permission, waiting for you to return. So maybe you were never sad. Maybe you were just distant, distant from your reactions, distant from your needs, distant from your own internal voice. That distance felt neutral at first, manageable, even productive. But over time, neutrality without presence begins to feel like emptiness. And emptiness is not always about loss. Sometimes it's about absence of contact. Contact with yourself. The version of you that feels before it explains. The version of you that reacts before it edits. The version of you that exists beneath composure. Reconnection doesn't turn you into someone unstable. It doesn't make you dramatic. It doesn't unravel your life. It simply reduces the space between your outer functioning and your inner experience. That reduction changes everything. Because when you're aligned internally, you don't need to force aliveness. It returns naturally, not as fireworks, but as subtle depth. You feel slightly more when something resonates. You feel slightly more when something hurts. You feel slightly more when something moves you. And that slightly more is enough. Enough to remind you that you're here, fully here. Disconnection made you efficient, but efficiency isn't intimacy. It isn't meaning. It isn't depth. Meaning emerges when you inhabit your experiences, not just complete them. You don't need to quit your life. You don't need to escape your responsibilities. You don't need to reinvent your identity. You just need to stop standing outside of yourself. The world didn't become flat. You stepped back from feeling it, and stepping back once protected you. Now stepping forward can restore you. Forward doesn't mean reckless. It means present. Present when discomfort surfaces. Present when joy flickers. Present when something unsettles you. Instead of smoothing every emotional edge, you let some edges remain. Edges create texture. Texture creates depth. Depth creates meaning. You may still have quiet days. You may still feel tired. You may still question things. But the difference is this: you won't feel absent from yourself anymore. You won't feel like an observer in your own life. You'll feel embedded in it. Embedded doesn't mean overwhelmed. It means connected. Connected to sensation. Connected to reaction. Connected to presence. You don't need constant intensity to know you're alive. You just need contact. Contact with breath. Contact with emotion. Contact with thought before it turns into analysis. You're not sad. You're not broken. You're not defective. You adapted. An adaptation once helped you survive. Now you're choosing something slightly different. Not survival. Presence. Not containment. Contact. Not distance. Return. Return to your internal landscape. Return to the subtle signals you once ignored. Return to the quiet reactions you dismissed. Return to yourself. Because sadness asks to be felt, but disconnection asks to be closed. Closed gently. Closed gradually. Closed through awareness. And the moment you notice you're slightly distant is the moment you begin coming back.